She was hunted, betrayed, poisoned. Once hunted, now hunter. Welcome to Once Upon a Crime, where dark truths, lost legends, and twisted fairy tales come to light. And so her story begins. The girl they called Snow White. We now walk through the gates of Chapter 4. But if you're still wondering how it all began, the previous chapters lie hidden in the shadowed corners of this channel, waiting to be found. Since the king's death, the palace had changed. Tapestries were removed, walls repainted in colder tones. Familiar maids replaced by new, quiet-faced servants who never looked Snow White in the eyes. The warmth that once made the palace a home had been scraped clean, leaving behind only marble and silence. And Sarah, once a mere servant, now sat on the throne like she was born to it. Orders came quickly, curtains closed early, curfews were enforced, and Snow White's movements were subtly but strictly watched. Then came the final blow. Sarah called her into the throne room, alone. "You'll leave for the Eastern Academy by week's end," she said calmly, pouring herself tea. "A proper place for royal girls. You'll be safe there and educated. That is what your father wanted." Snow White stood tall. She no longer bowed. "You cannot command me," she said coldly. "You are not my blood. You are not my queen." Sarah's hand paused mid-air. A flicker of something dark passed through her expression. Then she smiled. "I may not be your blood, child, but I am your ruler, and what I command you will obey." "And if I refuse?" Snow White asked, voice like steel wrapped in silk. Sarah's eyes glittered like a snake coiled in candlelight. "Then you will learn what it means to be truly alone." Silence stretched between them. Snow White's jaw clenched, but she said nothing more. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. That night, she did not sleep. She stared at the moon from her window, the same moon her mother once gazed at. She would not run. She would not leave. And if Sarah wanted war, then war is what she would get. Because Snow White was no longer a girl in mourning. She was her mother's daughter, and the crown didn't scare her. Unbeknownst to Snow White, Sarah was already scripting the final chapter of her tale. She announced her supposed departure to the Eastern School Academy that weekend. Snow White barely reacted, just a flicker of a smirk and a thought to herself, "We'll see about that." Every weekend, without fail, Snow White rode deep into the forest, her bow slung across her back, hair tied high, sharp eyes scanning the trees. At her side, Rigor, the royal huntsman. She trusted him. He had taught her how to track deer, to strike fast, to survive. He was quiet, constant, unwavering. What she didn't know was that Rigor no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to Sarah. Not by love, not by loyalty, but by spell. He had eaten the apple, a flawless, red-skinned fruit Sarah offered with her softest smile. One bite, and his will snapped like a twig underfoot. His thoughts remained, but his body moved by her command. Protect her, guide her, and when the moment feels right, let her eat this apple, Sarah had whispered, lips stained with juice from her own enchanted fruit. Rigor said nothing. He never did. The sun dipped low, staining the trees in molten gold. The forest, once familiar, seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet. The usual rustle of birds and chatter of small creatures had vanished into shadow. Snow White adjusted the quiver on her back. "Rigor," she said, not turning to him. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer at first. just walked beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. She looked at him. "You're quiet today." "I'm always quiet," he replied. But there was something hollow in his voice, like the words weren't truly his. They moved deeper into the woods. Rigger stopped near a clearing. He reached into his pack and handed her an apple, red, perfect, shining in the dim light. "You earned this," he said. "That boar didn't stand a chance." Snow White smiled, breathless and flushed, as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Rigger handed her the apple. She took it, turning it in her hand. It was flawless. Too flawless. Something in her gut twisted, but she ignored it. She took a bite. And then, her knees gave out. She collapsed without a sound. Rigger stood frozen for a heartbeat, then turned and ran toward the castle. He never looked back. Rigger burst into the castle, breath shallow, his boots echoing against the stone halls. He should have gone straight to her, but something made him pause. Instead, he crept toward her chamber, silent as snowfall. From the shadows, he watched through a crack in the door. And there was his face. Framed in candlelight, his portrait sat upon a small altar. His eyes stared back at him, cold and hollow. 2 red candles flickered beside it. A death spell. His blood turned to ice. This was her sanctuary, where Sarah's secrets grew like roots in poisoned soil. Ancient scrolls lay unfurled across velvet-lined tables, marked with runes he couldn't read but somehow feared. Bundles of dried herbs and the same lace she once used to serve the queen tea were neatly folded beside tiny glass vials. He watched her whisper into the dark, calling out names only the shadows answered. Sarah never carried a sword. She didn't need to. Her weapons were laced tea and honeyed words. Her poison came dressed as kindness. Her army? Men who mistook her magic for love. And her next move? Already written. Kill Rigger. Rigger stepped back from the door, the weight of truth pressing heavy on his chest. He turned to leave, silent as breath, but a creak in the floorboard. Sarah's head snapped toward the door, her eyes narrowed, sharp as daggers in moonlight. "Who's there?" She moved quickly, pulling the chamber door wide. Her gaze met Rigger's. For the briefest second, something unreadable passed between them. Recognition, betrayal, perhaps even fear. Then her voice rose like a bell struck hard. "Thief!" she cried, her tone sharpened with false terror. "Guards!" Within moments, the heavy boots of the palace watch thundered down the corridor. Rigger didn't run. He stood frozen, knowing escape was impossible, and that anything he'd say would be twisted into lies. The guards seized him without question. Steel clamped around his wrists. Sarah stood behind them, clutching her chest, eyes gleaming with practiced fear. "Take him to the dungeons," she commanded softly, "and search his quarters. He may have stolen more." And so, the loyal huntsman who had once carried the kingdom's trust was dragged beneath its stones into the dark, while above, the woman who wore another's crown smiled at how easily stories could be rewritten. Back in the forest. The trees stood still, as if the entire forest held its breath. Snow White lay sprawled on the forest floor, her bow beside her, her breath faint. The bite of the cursed apple had drained the color from her cheeks. Her heartbeat slowed. The world around her dimmed. But the forest was never silent for long. From the shadows, a figure emerged, barefoot, cloaked not in royal fabric, but in twilight itself. Lilith, older than magic, wilder than myth, she walked between realms where forgotten girls whispered her name like a prayer or a warning. She knelt beside Snow White, brushing dark hair from her pale face. Lilith had seen death before, but this one was different. This girl wasn't meant to die. Not yet. She cupped Snow's face in her hands and whispered, "Not this way, not for you." Lilith reached into her satchel and took out a vial glowing with dim violet light, distilled from stardust and memories. She uncorked it, letting a single drop fall onto Snow White's lips. The girl's body twitched, her lashes fluttered. Snow White coughed just once and gasped, as though waking from a nightmare she couldn't remember. She blinked up at Lilith. "Who are you?" she rasped. Lilith smiled faintly. "Someone who's seen too many girls fall silent. I won't let you be one of them." Snow White sat up slowly, confusion clouding her gaze. The last thing she remembered was the apple in her hand, and Rigger's eyes watching her. Why did he... Lilith placed a gentle finger on her lips. Later. She stood, offering Snow her hand. "We don't have time. The woman who took your mother's place is writing the ending to your story." Snow White took her hand, strength returning to her limbs. "Then I'll write a new one," she said through clenched teeth. Lilith nodded. "Good girl. Come. It's time the hunted became the hunter." The forest deepened as they walked, past rivers that whispered, beneath trees that remembered. The world twisted gently, bending around Lilith's presence. Snow White followed, limbs still heavy from the poisoned fruit, yet drawn by something she couldn't explain. They stopped before an ancient tree. Its bark cracked, wide enough to swallow them both. Lilith placed a hand on it and whispered a word, in a language older than kingdoms. The bark shimmered, then split open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into warm violet light. "Come," Lilith said. "This place remembers girls like you." Snow White followed. At the bottom, they emerged into a castle unlike any she had ever seen, not carved by man, but grown by time itself. Vines crawled its stone walls like veins. The windows reflected no light, only memory. Fireplaces burned with no wood, and not a single throne stood at its center. "Where are we?" Snow whispered. Lilith turned. "A place between worlds. No queen rules here. No king's name carries weight. Spells cannot find you, not even bloodbound ones. This castle chooses who enters, and it chose you." For days, maybe weeks, maybe moons, time forgot Snow White, and in return, she forgot the girl who trusted poisoned apples and velvet lies. Lilith healed her, not with potions, but with knowledge. She taught her the difference between sorcery and power, between knowledge and wisdom. She taught her how to read spell scrolls and how to bind intention with breath. They crafted enchantments in silence, bottled protection in glass jars, carved sigils into stone and into the bones of dead trees. Magic isn't light or dark, Lilith said one evening, tracing ash across Snow's palms. It only reflects the one who casts it. That's why it's feared. It reveals the truth. They trained under moonlight. Lilith placed a dagger in Snow's hand and said, "This is not to kill. This is to claim." She taught her how to move like shadow, how to strike without anger, but with clarity. "How to fight?" Snow once asked. Lilith smiled. "No, my dear. How to win." Snow White began to change. She still wore her braids, but her hands bore ink and ash. Her eyes were sharper. She could taste lies before they were spoken. She was not the queen's daughter anymore. She was becoming something else, something older, something the world thought it had erased. The day came when the stars burned a little brighter. The trees swayed differently as if whispering, "It is time." Snow White stood at the edge of the castle's stone balcony, her cloak dark as raven's wings, a blade at her hip, and spell runes inked into her skin. Each one earned, not given. Lilith approached, a gentle weight in the silence. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked. Snow White nodded. "It's time. You are ready. Not just to return, but to face the truth, to confront what was taken, and to reclaim it not with vengeance, but with righteousness." She wasn't just a girl with a broken crown anymore. She was a woman with the wisdom of death, betrayal, and resurrection etched into her bones. Lilith led her to a stone altar within the castle heart. One by one, she laid down the sacred tools, gifts for the journey ahead. A dagger forged from obsidian and sorrow, a cloak woven from moth wings and twilight to move unseen, a ring with a drop of her own blood sealed within to remind her who she is, and finally a mirror shard, enchanted to reflect not faces but true intent. Snow White embraced Lilith, fierce and full of silent gratitude. "Thank you for everything. I love you, like I loved Mother, maybe even more." Lilith smiled, and for the first time, her eyes glistened. She pulled Snow White close and whispered, "What's the odd?" she said, teasing gently. "I'm your self-proclaimed fairy godmother." They laughed, quietly, like a secret between old souls. But beneath it, there was something deeper, understanding. Lilith touched her forehead, murmuring a final blessing. "You are not a pawn in anyone's tale now, Snow. You are the ink, the pen, the fire that writes its ending." And with that, Snow White turned toward the ancient door carved into the tree, ready to step back into the world that once tried to bury her. But this time, she wasn't returning as a princess. She was coming back as the storm. The journey doesn't end here. Beyond the shattered castle and moonlit ruins lies a path few dare to tread. In the next episode of our tale, Snow White finds herself in a forgotten corner of the world, where an ancient tower pierces the sky, and within it waits a girl, with secrets woven into her hair. Rapunzel. And by the power vested in Snow White herself, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tap that little bell, and who knows, you just might live happily ever after.